One short document, just a few dozen pages. And yet, it helped inspire revolutions across four continents. It shaped the founding ideology of nations that at the height of Cold War governed roughly a third of the world's total population. It's been called the sharpest critique of capitalism that's ever been written and blamed for some of the deadliest regimes of the 20th century. So, how does one pamphlet written by two men barely out of their 20s produce verdicts that extreme that is actually visible almost 2 centuries later? We're not here to tell you if communism was good or that it was actually evil. That argument isn't going away. And we're not going to settle it in the next 20 minutes. What we are going to do is decode the actual document, the ideas, the history, the reasoning behind it, so that whichever side of the debate you actually land on, you are actually arguing from understanding instead of plain mere slogans. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the Communist Manifesto decoded. To understand why this pamphlet hit as hard as it did, you have to see the world that actually went on to produce it. It's 1848. Europe is deep into industrial revolution, and for millions of workers that revolution does not feel like progress. 14 and 16-hour workdays were normal. Children as young as 5 or 6 worked in textile mills and coal mines. Safety regulations barely existed. Machinery maimed workers routinely with absolutely no insurance policy, no compensation, and often no recourse at all. At the same time, a new class of factory owners, the bourgeoisies in the language of the era, were accumulating wealth at a scale Europe had rarely seen. City exploded in size almost overnight, so did the slums surrounding them. If you were a factory worker in 1848, exhausted, underpaid, watching your 6-year-old head to the mill instead of schoolhouse, would capitalism actually look like freedom to you? Or would it look like a new kind of cage? That question, ladies and gentlemen, sits at the emotional core of everything that is going to follow. Karl Marx didn't invest working class anger, he was trying to explain it and organize it. So, who actually wrote this thing? Karl Marx was a German philosopher, economist, and a journalist born in 1880 in Trier, in what's now called Western Germany. By his late 20s, his political writing had gotten him expelled from more than one country. In Paris and later Brussels, Marx built a close intellectual partnership with Friedrich Engels, the son of a wealthy textile manufacturer who had seen industrial exploitation up close from inside his own family's factories in Manchester, England. In 1847, the two were commissioned by a political organization called the Communist League to actually write a statement of the group's principle. The result, published in London in February 1848 and drafted mainly by Marx from ideas the pair had developed together, was the Communist Manifesto. Now, there's one thing that is actually worth clearly stating. This was not a technical policy document, it wasn't a 5 year plan or a legal constitution. At its heart, it was a political pamphlet meant to be read fast and felt hard. Marx spent much of the rest of his life, and he went on to die in London in 1883, trying to work out the deepest economics in a far denser 3 volume work, Capital. If the manifesto is the trailer, Capital is the movie. Let's get into the text itself. It opens with one of the most famous first lines in political writing. A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. Dramatic? Sure, but what follows is a fairly systematic argument, one we can boil down to 5 core ideas. The manifesto's first chapter opens with a line arguably even more famous than the preamble itself. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Marx's argument was that most of human history can be read as a sequence of conflicts between groups with opposing economic interests: lords and peasants, slaveholders and the enslaved, guild masters and the journeymen, and in his own era, factory owners and factory workers. Each conflict, he argued, eventually resolves, usually through upheaval, into a new argument which then produces a new conflict of its own. Capitalism, in his view, wasn't the endpoint of the cycle, it was just the latest stage. You don't have to accept the theory to see why it was powerful. It gave people a framework for reading their own economic frustration as a part of historical pattern instead of personal bad luck. Marx didn't actually dismiss capitalism as pure disaster. The manifesto actually contains some of the most admiring language about capitalism's productive power that Marx ever wrote, crediting it with creating more advanced technology and output in barely a century than every previous era combined. But he argued capitalism's profit depended on something specific, workers producing more economic value than they were paid in wages. Marx called that gap surplus value. An owner pays a worker enough to live on, then sells what that worker produces for far more than that. The difference becomes the profit. To Marx, that wasn't a flaw in the system, it was the engine of the system. Whether you see that gap as fair compensation for the risk an owner takes on or an exploitation built into machinery depends a lot on which economic tradition you are actually standing in. And that argument is very much still alive today. This is the single most misunderstood part of the whole document. People hear the word communism and often picture the state seizing your house, your car, your phone. This is not what the manifesto is actually arguing. Let me explain. Marx specifically targets what he calls the means of production: factories, large scale farmland, mines, industrial machinery, the infrastructure which is actually used to generate wealth at scale. The manifesto has essentially nothing to say about your toothbrush. Marx's argument was that the private ownership of those large productive assets concentrates economic power into a very few hands, and that it's concentration, not personal property itself, that he wanted to actually go on to abolish. If private ownership of industry is the root problem, Marx's proposed fix is collective ownership, something that he calls collective ownership. And it actually explains that the people who actually produce the value, which is the workers in this case, should control the workplace themselves rather than one private owner extracting profit from their labor. Supporters argue this could end exploitation at source, no owner skimming surplus value off the top. Critics go on to argue that removing individual ownership removes the incentive to take risks and to go on to innovate and manages resources efficiently, and that collective control in practice has often meant control by a small governing elite rather than by workers themselves. Both arguments have had real historical evidences behind them, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. The long term goal is a classless society. Marx envisioned an eventual world without a permanent divide between owners and workers, where the class conflicts that, in his telling, had driven all of human history so far would simply just cease to exist or stop existing in the first place. It's worth to actually be honest here, folks. This was always the most utopian, least detailed part of Marx's project. He wrote comparatively little about what a classless society would actually look like day to day or how a modern economy would run without markets or private industry. That vagueness became one of the most consequential gaps in the whole ideology because it left the how almost entirely up to whoever tried to build it next. So, why did an obscure 1848 pamphlet, one that merely made a ripple on release, eventually become one of the most translated, most printed, and discussed political documents in human history? A few reasons. Industrialization kept intensifying, and brutal working conditions persisted in many places well into the 20th century. Organized labor movements were growing fast and needed a shared political vocabulary. Marx's class conflict framework gave them one. Colonial exploitation gave anti imperial movements across Asia, Africa, and Latin America their own reasons to actually find the manifesto's critique compelling. Even far outside the European factory context, it was actually written in. And simply, inequality is one of the most durable sources of political grievances in human history. A document that is actually offering both a diagnosis and a call to action for that particular grievances was always going to travel well ahead in time. No discussion of the manifesto's real world legacy is complete without its largest experiment, the Soviet Union. In 1917, Russia, exhausted by the First World War and still ruled by an autocratic Tsar, collapsed into revolution. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin and explicitly inspired by Marx, seized power and began building the world's first self declared communist state. What followed over the next 7 decades is genuinely a mixed record, and any honest account has to hold both halves at once before actually giving a solid conclusion. On one side, the Soviet Union industrialized at extraordinary speed, transforming from largely an agrarian empire into a global superpower within a few decades. Literacy rates rose dramatically. The state built an extensive and, for its time, genuinely accessible public healthcare and education systems. In the Second World War, that industrial base and human mobilization played a decisive role in defeating Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front. On the other hand, the same government that built those institutions also ran one of the most extensive and excessive systems of political repressions of the 20th century. Under Stalin, especially, forced collectivization contributed to devastating famines. Political dissent was criminalized, millions were actually sent to labor camp. The Gulag system sometimes far goes way over offenses as vague as antisocial sentiment. For the entire life of the state, there were no free elections, no independent press, and no legal political opposition that existed at all, and this raises some concerns. Economically, the centrally planned system that replaced private industry struggled increasingly with efficiency and innovation as the century actually wore on. Chronic shortages of consumer goods were a defining feature of the daily Soviet life by the 1970s and the 1980s. By the late 1980s, stagnation and reform efforts by Gorbachev's Glasnost and Persky among them were something that were rapidly discussed and had also opened cracked into the system that couldn't actually contain it for a very long time. The Soviet Union formally dissolved in December 1991. Was the USSR a faithful implementation of Marx's idea, or was it a distortion of them? That's genuinely one of the most contested questions in modern political history. Supporters of the Marx idea often argue Lenin and Stalin built an authoritarian state that actually betrayed the manifesto's spirit. Critics actually also go on to argue that the outcome was a predictable result of trying to implement the manifesto's core ideas at a national scale. We're not going to resolve that argument for you, but what we'd be doing is but what we'd be doing you is a disservice if we only showed you one side of the ledger. So why nearly 180 years after the publication are we still talking about a 23-page pamphlet? Because the underlying question it actually raises is how a society should balance economic freedom against economic inequality. And this particular scenario that I'm actually explaining to you actually never got solved, and it just keeps resurfacing in new forms and new revolutions. Supporters of Marx critique today don't usually point to the Soviet Union. They point to the raising wealth inequality inside modern capitalist economies. They point to labor protections that actually emerged partly from pressure by socialist and communist movements, the 8-hour workday, the weekend child labor laws, and they point to public systems like universal basic healthcare and free education, which many trace back to that same tradition of collective provision. Critics point to the 20th century's authoritarian communist states as a cautionary tale about concentrating political and economic power in the same hands. They point to market economy's track record on innovation and rising living standards, and they also go on to argue that individual economic freedom is a value worth protecting in its own life, not just a mechanism for producing good outcomes. Neither side has run out of arguments, and that's arguably the best evidence for why this document actually still matters and is relevant to today's day and age. Not because it settled anything, but because it permanently challenged and changed what people expect from the governments and economies to justify. The manifesto itself actually closes with one of the most relying and rallying cries in political history, which says, "The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains." Its final line calls it "the working men of all countries to unite," a phrase latter which is actually popularized in a slightly different form you probably heard even if you have never read the original. Workers of the world, unite. Here's what's worth sitting with as we actually go on to wrap up. Capitalism has generated innovation and material wealth at scale nothing before it ever managed. But it has also generated real, persistent questions about inequality, exploitation, and who actually gets to share that wealth or who actually gets a share of the wealth. Communism offered radically different answers to those questions, but nearly every large scale attempt to build it has run into serious problems with things like political freedom, economic efficiency, or even both. The argument between these two visions have been shaping the last 2 centuries of human history, and it's in elections, it's in labor movements, it's in wars, it's in discussions in YouTube channels like how we're doing now. And the shape of the modern welfare state, it's still shaping the world today, whether or not anyone is actually involved to call it by Marx's name itself. It just exists in different movements, but with the same mere ideology that was once conveyed by Marx. This video was never about telling you which side is right? That is for you to decide. It's about making sure that when you do take a side, and most people eventually do, you're doing it because you genuinely understand the actual argument, not because of a slogan or a meme or a textbook that only showed you half the picture, right? Because that's the only way an idea this old and this consequential is actually worth agreeing about.